All right, welcome to Module 14. We're moving on to our second punch discussion. So same process that you went through with the Naked Kiss. I'm going to go through the primer presentation. I'm going to try to do it relatively quickly so you can move on to the screening. All right, here we go. So again, please make sure to take some notes. You don't have to follow the primer presentation verbatim, but that it just provides you some sort of context for your write-up on the punch discussion message board. Okay, so punch discussion 2, Haine is the film that we're going to be watching. I should say that you are going to be watching. All right, so let's get to it. Again, just as a reminder, you're watching the entirety of this lecture video for the primer presentation, some context. We're using the social science theory for this film today, so I need to give you a little bit of historical context. So please take some notes to inform your screening. Take some notes while you watch the film. Once we're done with the lecture video here, you're gonna split off and go watch Haine via Canopy. Again, all the films that we watched in this class are on Canopy. Again, the movie we're watching is Haine, L-A space H-A-I-N-E. Once you're done watching the film, head over to the punch discussion. Again, the link to the punch discussion board is in the module, so you can just click that. It'll bring you right to the discussion board where you could write up your 4-sentence minimum interpretation of the film off any of the primer topics or your own sort of take on it. All right, and make sure to do that by November 17th by 11:59 p.m. So write and post your punch discussion contribution on the discussion board November 17th by 11:59 p.m. And as a reminder, your analysis paper is due December 1st by 11:59 p.m. All right, so Haine. Haine was released in 1995. Haine is a French film. This is our writer and director, Matteo Cassavetes. All righty. Quickly, I went over this last module for anybody who stuck around, but just in case you didn't, I wanted to make sure that you knew how to enable subtitles on Canopy. So I took a screenshot here. Once you select the film Haine, and I'll use my little annotate tool, you bring up the profile for the film, move over to CC, stands for closed captions. You click it, make sure to hit English, because again, this movie is in French, so you're gonna need English subtitles unless you speak French. So again, if you don't speak French, please make sure to enable subtitles if they do not come up by themselves. All right, so let's get to a little bit of historical context for this film. So we are in 1995, but let's kind of back up a little bit to, again, give a little bit of historical context. So we are using the social science theory, and again, here's just a little bit of research. France, much like the US, has an uneasy relationship between civilian and police, and this is linked through systemic racism, police brutality, and systemic oppression. We're going to talk a little bit more about how systemic racism takes place in France specifically, but let's just kind of keep going here. Police brutality is often targeted towards minority youths, again, sort of as an act of systemic racism. Young men perceived as Arab or Black are 20 times more likely to be stopped by police than white men. And I want to give a little bit of information regarding sort of housing facilities in France. So we have the banlieues. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I gave myself a little pronunciation there. But the banlieues are essentially suburbs outside of Paris, France. And again, right, I'm giving you a very quick sort of general commentary to set the stage for this film. Obviously, it's more complicated than this, but again, just to kind of give us a little bit of insight. when I was doing research, it certainly seemed at the time in 1995, and it seems like it still sort of holds true. But there's this sort of idea that the further away you are from Paris, France, there's a perception that sort of the lower you are in the class spectrum. So banlieues are essentially the suburbs outside of Paris, France. The closer you are to Paris, the more so you're kind of considered upper class. The further away from Paris, you're kind of considered lower class. So we have a class division. People in banlieues outside of Paris often experience social exclusion. So again, sort of the idea of classism at play, opportunity, right? Who has opportunity and who doesn't, who has resources and who doesn't. The working class banlieues, these are called minguettes. Minguettes are housing estates, and you'll see this in the film. Quite a bit of the action in the first act of the film takes place in sort of like a minguettes area, and you'll see plenty of sort of like high apartment complexes. But minguettes feature a high concentration of young people from immigrant backgrounds. In France, we have African immigrants. 4 out of 5 Black people in France are of African immigrant origin. And then from North Africa, we have Arab immigrants in France. French people of Arab origin are the second largest ethnic group behind French-born people, behind French origin people. There's a severe lack of government funding and support within minguettes. This leads to rundown housing, unemployment, drug trade, and drug use. In addition to this, the media also has a reputation of demonizing minguettes and demonizing lower class. And again, I use that in quotes, right? It's a social construct. But because of that, you know, again, people in minguettes suffer, right? They have a loss of resources because of this perception that, you know, the further away you live from France, the lower class you are, and that sort of feeds into this. And in addition to that, there's a sense of media demonization, which the film confronts pretty explicitly in one scene. It's kind of humorous the way it approaches it, but it's pretty clear. But often, minguettes are portrayed as dangerous, violent, and dysfunctional places, while Paris is depicted as romantic, artistic, fantastic, and sanitized. And you'll see in this movie that this is, the filmmaker Matteo Cassavetes is very conscious of this. And the movie, without spoiling anything, sort of the first third into maybe about like, I would say probably right after the sort of like, it follows the hero's journey pretty closely. So if we kind of think of like that first act is in the known world for our 3 main characters, and that first act takes place in the minguettes, and then eventually something happens and it propels them sort of on their journey into the unknown. And in this film, the unknown is Paris, France. So you'll kind of see how this film is playing with this. Okay, so some more context specifically on police brutality. Police brutality is pervasive in working class banlieues and targets minority groups. 80% of French police force are from rural areas called provincial towns. Provincial, might be mispronouncing that. I don't even think that's like a French term and I'm mispronouncing it. But 80% of the French police force are from rural areas, right outside of the minguettes. The ethnic makeup in these rural areas are predominantly white European. Coming out of the hot summer of 1981, 1990s France was an especially hostile area with police brutality and reactionary violence. The hot summer of 1981 was sort of a stretch of time where, again, the media demonization was sort of focusing on petty crime within minguettes. And there, you know, very likely was some petty crime, just as there would be in any areas, but it was a focus on that. And because of that, we started to see a higher rate of police brutality. And so coming out of that time, what's what I'm looking for? The climate in 1990s France was definitely hostile between police and reactionary violence from civilians. So again, I sort of distill it in this cycle, this idea of you would have police brutality, excessive use of force as well, and that would be countered with protests. And then police were using violence to break up the protests, and then you would see reactionary violence. Riots would break out, and we'd see a reactionary violence to the systemic oppression. And it just continues this cycle. And that's very much what the film's exploring. Haine is French for the hate. And again, you'll kind of see how this movie is exploring this explicitly. So I also want to kind of build the timeline for Haine and how Mathieu Kassovitz basically made this movie as an act of protest. And specifically the murder of Makomi Mbawali is what specifically influenced Mathieu Kassovitz to write this film. But let's build a bit of a timeline here. In 1990, a young man of Spanish origin was killed in a motorbike crash while being chased by police. In 1991, an Arab teenager was shot and killed by a supermarket security guard. 1992, there was a murder of 18-year-old Mohammed Bahari by police. He was shot and killed by police. Youths attacked a police station and burned cars in a riot. 1993, murder of Makomi Mbawali. Makomi Mbawali was killed by a police officer at point blank range while chained to a radiator while in police custody. And again, Kassovitz, I did again a little research, which I don't normally do, right? We like to keep the movie as an artifact, but I did a little bit of research with Kassovitz, with an interview with him with the Criterion, and he specifically cited the murder of Makomi Mbawali as a motivating factor for his film, of why he wanted to make it and why there was an urgency for this film to be made. And you'll see in the movie somewhat a recreation of, or a dramatization, I should say, of Makomi Mbawali's murder. And the film, again, it's weird talking about like spoilers, right? But I don't want to say what happens in the scene, okay? But you'll see how Mathieu Kassovitz is certainly creating this scene to act as a mirror, right? To sort of show people, right, civilians, both people in France, and also that this movie traveled around the world, right? This movie got distribution in America from Universal Pictures. And you'll see how he's trying to serve a mirror, right? He's trying to be reflexive. He's trying to communicate to audiences. Again, at the time in 1993, in 1995, to be specific, where there wasn't really as much media coverage on these sort of things, and what can happen behind closed doors while somebody is in police custody, and specifically a minority is in police custody, and they don't maybe necessarily have the resources, and that just kind of continue to be oppressed. And you'll see again what could happen behind closed doors in police custody. Okay. So I have some resources. Again, you could always check out further reading with these links. Okay, so our credits are writer, director, co-editor, Mathieu Kassovitz. The director of photography is Pierre Haine. And then we have our cast. There's really only 3 primary characters throughout the entire film. You have Vincent Cassel, who plays Vince, Hubert Kundi, who plays Hubert, and Saeed Tagamawi, who plays Saeed. All right. So here are our primer points. So just like with The Naked Kiss, I'm going to read through these and offer a little bit of commentary as we go. Okay, let me make sure to, there we go. Okay, so again, I kind of start this with a broad question up top. What is Kassovitz trying to say about the relationship between civilian and police, specifically in 1995 France? But consider how this film is functioning as an act of protest and response. I try to kind of set the stage of how France was in 1995 and is very much still. And I'm sure we can also see, similarities around the world and very much in America. So again, this movie is not just speaking to France, right? Its message is larger, and consider that. You'll see how the movie uses Abdel. I'm going to mispronounce his name. They don't mention his name very often, but Abdel Ichaka. I'm sorry, but how he acts as a sort of symbolic character, and how his fate motivates our three key characters. Okay. Then moving into the social science theory. The film opens with a bit of narration from Hubert's character, but after that, Cassavetes cuts to like documentary footage, real footage of police force, protests, and riots. And again, to be clear, those are separate things, but he cuts to different footage. And the very opening shot, even before Hubert's bit of commentary, bit of narration, I should say, is a shot of a protester kind of calling out to a bunch of riot officers in riot gear. And he says a line of dialogue. And that's the first thing you see. That's the first shot. You might want to take note of what he says, because then we get that. Then we get the bit of narration from Hubert. Excuse me. Then the film cuts to basically a montage of all of this, documentary or news footage, and the footage is set to Bob Marley and the Wailers song "Burnin' and Lootin'," and it echoes over this footage. Consider why. What's the encoding choice there with this use of soundtrack and the footage that we're seeing? Is Cassavetes trying to speak to the people or to the police or both? Again, the idea of the hate. What is he talking about when he says the hate? That's the title of the film. There are many lines of dialogue that speak to this. Especially there's a key scene in a bathroom between Hubert and Vincent, where Hubert has a line, "Hate breeds hate." But we'll come back to that. Also, if anyone has seen Do the Right Thing, you'll probably notice a lot of influences that Cassavetes took from that film. That film came out in 1989. Haine came out in 1995. And you'll see, I think, how he's been inspired by Spike Lee's movie to make this. There's quite a bit of overlap with his approach formally and thematically. What is Cassavetes trying to say about the motive of some rioters, the concept of using violence to fight oppression, how Vin's is symbolic, and how Hubert is symbolic? Consider Vin's motivations of why he wants to kind of fight back, and then Hubert's. Very different. You'll see Vin's watching the television and looking for himself in the footage of a riot and bragging to other characters about him being there, telling everybody that he was at the riot and that he like burned this thing down, that he sort of has this pursuit of status and respect. He even has a few lines of dialogue that sort of links to this quite explicitly. Notice how the film also focuses on the repercussions of the riots. Consider Hubert's gym as a symbol. And notice that when we're introduced to Hubert, we are inside his gym and he's doing something in the gym. Consider what the encoding is there. What's the symbolic meaning? What is Cassavetes trying to say about the motivation of some police officers, specifically police officers who use excessive force? He offers some symbolic characters here. He doesn't really have a name, so I just call him the Notre Dame cop. He wears a Notre Dame jacket. Without spoiling anything, you see him twice in the film, I think only twice. And keep an eye out for his interaction with Vince on a rooftop and how maybe a dig at that police officer from Vince sort of upsets his ego. And when we see that character later on, it kind of informs, I think, his action. There's also a pretty disturbing scene that I referenced earlier of a scene that's supposed to be a questioning with two characters that quickly turns into a a scene of torture. And there's a few key lines of dialogue here that comes from a police officer that says, "It's so easy to go too far, but you mustn't, even though you're dying to." So keep that line in mind. Think about who he's saying that line of dialogue to. Then with the humanist theory, there's quite a few choices of symbols here. One of the opening shots after we get that piece of news footage, while Hubert is giving his narration, the camera is pushing in on like a globe, and a Molotov cocktail is slowly falling in slow motion on top of the globe. Think about the symbolic imagery there. Also, the three main characters, Minguette is called Thori. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Think about how that's sort of like a stand-in. The key scene, I'm just going to call it the bathroom monologue. It's the scene kind of goes in a weird direction that you might not be expecting, and a character pops up and gives a monologue. And I'm not quoting the whole thing, but think about how his story about Grunwaldzki is symbolic, right? There's a reason Matteo Cassavetes is having this guy say this story, especially at the time that he interrupts Hubert and Vinz to tell this story. What is that story metaphorical for? Hubert has this sort of motif throughout the film. He says it in the opening. He says it, I think, within the film, and then he says it towards the end again. And twice is narration, so it's like non-diegetic, but I'm pretty sure once is at least diegetic. Actually, I know it is. He says it to Vinz. But Hubert says the line, "So far, so good, so far, so good." And he keeps repeating that. And it ends with the line, "How you fall doesn't matter, it's how you land." So consider what he's saying there and why the film opens with this and also almost closes with this. I think it might actually be the last line as well. Then we have a couple other key lines. Hate breeds hate. But, and again, I think that obviously is a pretty clear message, but I think it's not as simple as that, right? I think Cassavetes' message is a little bit more complex because after that line of dialogue is delivered, somebody else says, "Well, if you turn the other cheek, you're a dead blank." So consider that, right? Having that kind of conversation between these two symbolic characters. Again, I'm not going to read all of the quotes, but look out for some key lines of dialogue that link to thematic exposition. The symbolism of a sign that says the world is yours, which is then erased to be the world is ours. And when that happens, take a note of the composition. When Cassavetes cuts to like a close-up to emphasize that, what's the composition that you see with the world is ours? Hubert's gym, again, as a symbol, how it acts as Hubert's introduction as a character. Also, there's a lot of camera movement in this movie. Again, something that Cassavetes is borrowing from Spike Lee, but that's okay. But there's a lot of steady cam push-ins. It's not on a dolly. It's a lot of steady cams, a lot of steady cam movement pushing in on subjects. And one shot that always sticks out to me is in the introduction of Hubert. And again, I'm not spoiling anything, but Vinz and Saeed are standing next to each other as they're watching Hubert do something, and the camera's on them. And then eventually Vinz walks out of frame, and the camera pushes in, and it pushes in on something. Well, I guess I spoiled it. It pushes in on a fight poster because Hubert used to be a boxer. And consider the meaning there, right? Maybe not only the reveal that we learn a little bit of backstory about Hubert, but the idea that Vinz was standing in front of the poster. Consider how pop culture acts as an influence, especially for Vinz's character. Excuse me. Notice when we're introduced to Vinz, the camera movement that takes place, it's a pan around his room. What is Cassavetes making us focus on in that? Also, his use of playing out scenes from movies and quoting dialogue from movies. Think about the choice there. There is one scene that really kind of breaks this movie out of the sort of realist approach that it mostly follows through with. And the camera, I don't even know how they did it, to be honest with you, because it's not like a helicopter shot. I think maybe they were running like a cable across the Minguette, and having the camera go on a cable. But the camera is just overhead and just passes over this housing district. And as it passes over, you hear music, and the music is diegetic, which I think is also very important. And the song is, I feel weird saying it, so I'm not going to say it, but F the Police. But it's like a remix. It's not just that song, it's a remix. So consider the choice of the song, consider the shot that you're seeing and how it's informing one another, and that the music is diegetic and how maybe that music is influencing that camera movement. Symbolic characters, consider Vinz as a symbolic character, Hubert as a symbolic character. Hubert is probably the sort of the most complex character, and I think a real insight into his character and his struggles is a scene between him and his mom at a kitchen table. There's a lot of dialogue there that you might want to jot down. Saeed is a symbolic character. The Notre Dame cop is a symbolic character. And then again, I don't have a name for the other cop, but there's sort of like a nice cop that helps our three main characters out in the film. Okay, then look at some formal choices made by Cassavetes. Again, there's a lot of movement. He sort of pulls away from using a master scene technical too much. There's not a lot of traditional coverage. Instead, we track with the characters a lot with a steady cam. It's almost like we're walking with them during their day-to-day. And he also keeps his framing pretty wide. And he pushes towards ensemble framing to always frame Vinz, Hubert, and Saeed together. They're almost always sharing the frame. And if they're not, think about why. And if they are we seeing anything else on top of it? Which leads me to my last one here. I'm not going to go on too long talking about it, but this is an example where Cassavetes does frame all three characters in the same frame. But in this moment, Hubert's in the foreground, Vinz and Saeed are in the background. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Hubert is in the left third of the frame, Vinz and Saeed are in the right third of the frame, and it's a shallow depth of field. So we're focused, the foreground is in critical focus. We're focusing on Hubert. And we're seeing his facial reactions, right? His facial expressions, his nonverbals. But in the background of the shot is Vinz and Saeed, and they're in soft focus. That being said, we can hear what Vinz is saying. And consider that choice, right? That very deliberate composition. We're still having them all together, but now he's using a shallow depth of field. Focus on Hubert's reactions to what Vinz is saying, and why do you think Cassavetes made this choice? Okay, so I put that there. We talked about the long takes with a controlled camera. A lot of this is shot steady cam. It's a lot of tracking shots that are longer takes. Okay, so I think that's about it. So that's it. Go ahead. Again, last video I did this. I'm not doing it again. So you know the process. I went over the presentation. I'm done. Go watch the film. Take notes according to our presentation here. Go back when you're done to the punch discussion. Again, the discussion board is linked in the module that you just saw this video in, and write up your at least 4-sentence commentary on the film from one of these topics, or you can kind of go in a different direction. But remember, it must be informed by the screening in some way, offer some sort of filmic evidence so I know you watched the film. All right, so I think that's it. I hope you like the film. Look forward to your commentary. I'll see you next module.